We've seen the temporal orientation of the Lord's Supper with respect to the past, as we remember what Christ accomplished on the cross, and also with respect to the future, with the way in which the Lord's Supper points us to the wedding feast of the Lamb in heaven. But the question still remains, what about now? What about the present significance of the celebration of the Lord's Supper? And it's at that point that the vast majority of the controversies that have emerged throughout church history have focused their attention. The majority report in church history favors the real presence of Christ in the celebration of the Lord's Supper, so that when we gather at the table, we are in a real communion with Him. And of course, not everybody believes that there's any special way in which He's present at the Lord's Supper, but that is clearly the majority report. But that's about all the majority report agrees on, because the real issue is the mode of that presence. In what way is Christ present at the Lord's table? Now, part of the issue of understanding the how of His presence is related to His words of institution. In all three synoptic Gospels that give us the historical narrative of the account of Christ's words of institution of this sacrament, all three of them have Jesus saying, "This is my body." Now, the question that has emerged in the controversies historically focuses on this word "is." How is it to be understood? And even though we may laugh in some kind of cynicism about various ways in which the verb "to be" may be used, thinking back to President Clinton's now famous remark, "It depends what the meaning of is," there are real controversies where the outcome of the debate rests upon what the meaning of is. Because in the English language, the word is indeed a part of the verb "to be." And usually we think of this verb "to be" as a linking verb that serves as a copula, from which the word copulate derives, by the way. A copula is that grammatical situation where the verb "is" represents an identification between the subject and the predicate. So that when something is said to be something else, the verb serves basically as an equals mark, where you can reverse the predicate and the subject without any loss in meaning. For example, if we would say, "A bachelor is an unmarried man," there is nothing in the predicate that's not already present in the notion of bachelor in the subject. And so there's an equal mark. We could reverse them and say, "An unmarried man is a bachelor." But in addition to this use of the verb "to be," there is also the metaphorical use where the verb "to be," or the word "is" in this case, may mean represents. And so you think, for example, of the "I am" statements of Jesus that are found in the Gospel of John, where Jesus says, "I am the vine, you are the branches, I am the good shepherd. I am the door through which men must enter. I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life," and so on, where he uses these expressions linked to the verb "to be." It's clear from any reading of those texts that what Jesus is doing here is using the representative sense of the verb "to be" in a metaphorical way. When he says, "I am the door," he is not saying crassly that where you have skin, he has some kind of wooden veneer, and where you have arms, he has hinges, or anything so absurd as that. He is meaning that I function metaphorically as a portal, an entrance point into the kingdom of God. If you want to enter God's kingdom, you've got to come through me, just as if you want to enter a room, you'd have to go through the door. And so we see Jesus using the verb in other contexts where he does not indicate an identity. And so when you get to the words of the institution of the Lord's Supper, the obvious question is, how is being used here? What is the meaning of is in this context? Is Jesus saying, this bread that I am breaking now really is my flesh? This cup of wine that I've blessed, this really is my blood, so that when people were drinking that wine, they were actually drinking his blood, and when they were eating the bread, they were actually eating his flesh, his physical body. That's what this controversy is about. And remember, in the first century Roman community, the Christians were in fact charged with the crime of cannibalism, because the rumors were that the Christians were meeting in secret, like in the catacombs, devouring somebody's body and drinking that person's blood. So the idea of a real connection between bread and flesh and wine and blood had already appeared that early in church history. In the 16th century, where the Lutherans and the Reformed, who agreed on so many things but could not come together in complete unity, found that the barrier that kept them apart was principally their understanding of the Lord's Supper, because Luther insisted on the identity meaning of the word is here, and he, in the midst of the discussions, kept repeating over and over again the Latin phrase, hoc est corpus meum. This is my body. Because in the Mass, in the Latin Mass, the words of institution, of course, were spoken in Latin, hoc est corpus meum. By the way, that's how the popular term hocus pocus derived, because the people didn't understand what the priest was saying when he was using the Latin in the Mass, and the people would say, well, that's just so much hocus pocus. You know, they heard the hoc est and then rhymed it with the pocus and so on. But that's another story. But in any case, one of the major controversies of the 16th century had to do with the Roman Catholic understanding of the Lord's Supper. Because the Roman Catholic Church, then and now, it taught, continues to teach, the doctrine of transubstantiation. Transubstantiation. And this is the view that the substance of the bread and wine are transferred supernaturally, or transformed, I should say, supernaturally, into the actual body and blood of Jesus. Now, the reason for the way in which it's formulated was because people come to church and they see bread and they see wine. Then they hear the prayer of consecration, and then they partake of the bread and the wine. And even after the prayer of consecration has taken place, to the observer, to the one who's experiencing the Lord's Supper, it still looks like bread. And it still tastes like bread. And if you would drop it on the floor, it would sound like bread, it smells like bread, and it feels like bread. It doesn't look like flesh, it doesn't smell like flesh. In other words, the five senses, when they observe or perceive the elements of bread and wine before the prayer of consecration and after the prayer of consecration, there is no discernible difference. And so the person can scratch their head and say, well, you're telling me about a miracle, but it sure doesn't look like a miracle's taken place here, because the things look exactly the same as they were beforehand. In order to account for this problem, the church came up with a formula, really not just a theological formula, but a philosophical formula to account for the phenomenon of the appearances of bread and wine remaining. And they reached back into the past to the philosophical categories of Aristotle and borrowed language from Aristotle to articulate their view. And let's take a moment to look back into Aristotelian categories. Aristotle was very much concerned with the nature of reality. And he made a distinction of objects, in real objects, between what he called their substance or their essence, the real stuff of what makes a thing what it is, its real essence, and what he called the accidens, which were not accidents that, unintentional wrecks or something of that sort, but the accidens referred to the external perceivable qualities of a thing. If you were to describe me, you would describe me in terms of my weight, in terms of my height, maybe the clothes that I'm wearing, my hairstyle, the color of my face, the color of my eyes. But in all of those descriptions, you are restricted to what you can see about me, to the external perceivable qualities. You don't know what I am in my personal essence. I don't know the essence of chalkness. I only see cylindrical shape, hardness I feel, and I see whiteness as the color. Those are all the outward perceivable qualities. Now, Aristotle believed that every object had its own substance, and every substance had its corresponding accidents. If you had the substance of an elephant, you would also have the accidents of an elephant. For Aristotle, if it looked like a duck, walked like a duck, and quacked like a duck, it was a duck, because the essence of duckness always produced the accidents of duckness, and anytime you saw the accidents of duckness, you would know that beneath the surface, what you couldn't see, would be the essence of duckiness, if you will. So in his philosophical attempt at defining the difference between surface perception and depth reality, the church borrowed from these categories and said that in the miracle of the Mass, a double miracle takes place. On the one hand, the substance of the bread and wine changes into the substance of the body and blood of Christ, while the accidents remain the same. Now, what does that mean? That means prior to the miracle, you have the substance of bread and the accidents of bread. You have the substance of wine and the accidents of wine. But after the miracle, you no longer have the substance of bread or the substance of wine. Instead, you have the substance of the body and blood of Christ. But you have the accidents of bread and wine remaining. So, you have the accidents of bread and the accidents of wine without their substance. Okay? And the second miracle is you have the substance of the body and blood of Christ without the accidents of flesh and blood. So that's where we see the double miracle. So that you have the substance of one thing and the accidents of another, which is something that, of course, Aristotle never allowed for in terms of nature. But that became the official formulation by the Roman Catholic Church, which formula, by the way, came under profound attack not only in the 16th century Reformation, but from within the Roman Catholic Church, from the progressive wing of the Catholic Church in Western Europe in the decade of the 60s, in the late 50s and early 50s, particularly in Germany and in Holland. The Dutch Roman Catholic theologian by the name of Edmund Schillebeeckx, don't try to spell it, it's almost unspellable, published a work called Christus, the Ontmoeting of God. That is, Christ, the sacrament of God in encounter, in which he introduced a new idea, in which he said that what happens in the miracle of the Mass is not a magical or supernatural transformation of the substance of one thing into the substance of another. So it wasn't transubstantiation, according to Schillebeeckx, but it was transignification. That what happens in the Mass is that the elements of bread and wine take on now a heavenly significance. There's a real change in the significance of the elements, even though the nature of the elements remains the same. He was supported by the Dutch Catechism and some other progressive theologians at that time, and it created a major controversy within the Roman Catholic Church. And the basic precept that these theologians were arguing for was this, that the Church's teaching on terms of its content remains unchanging. The truth of Rome is immutable. It will never change. But how that truth is communicated or formulated is subject to change. And so they're saying we can still talk about the miracle of the Mass, but we don't have to articulate it in Aristotelian terms or according to the ancient formulations. And that was the standpoint that these people took. To which the Pope responded in 1965 with an important encyclical. Paul VI published an encyclical entitled Mysterium Fidei, the mystery of the faith, in which he responds to this issue and says that not only with respect to the Lord's Supper and the Mass is the substance or the content of the doctrine immutable, but its formulation as well. And he said, no more of this trying to get rid of the Aristotelian formulation of transubstantiation. It stands. And so that remains the official view of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, Luther objected to transubstantiation because he believed that it involved a frivolous miracle, unnecessary. He said you don't have to go through all of this substance and actions distinction when we can still have a view of the real corporeal presence of Christ in the Last Supper. Luther believed that the real blood of Jesus and the real flesh of Jesus was present in the elements, but they are in, under, and through the elements. The elements don't become the body and blood of Christ, but rather the body and blood of Christ are supernaturally added to the elements, but they are in, under, and through them so that they're not visible as such. But he argued still for the real presence of the physical body and blood of Christ. Now, the Reformers, on the other hand, the Calvin and the Swiss and Scots Reformers, rejected Luther's view, not on sacramental grounds, but on Christological grounds. And I will take an entire lecture, if we need to explain what the issue is with respect to our understanding of the human nature of Christ as it relates to the celebration of the Lord's Supper, because that's what the debate is about. Because when we're talking about the body and blood, We're not talking about the divine nature, because the divine nature does not have a body, and the divine nature does not have blood. Body and blood are properties or attributes of the humanity of Jesus. And so how we understand the behavior of that body and blood has a tremendous impact on our deeper understanding of the human nature of Christ himself. And so the controversy became focused on that point. Now, Calvin, for example, in the 16th century, was in one sense like Adolf Hitler. I perhaps shouldn't say that, because there are people who anyway would associate Calvin with Hitler as blood brothers, but only in this sense that they have in common one thing, that Hitler was forced to fight a war on two fronts. And the historians and military historians said if he hadn't opened up the Eastern Front with Russia, he probably would have achieved his conquest of Western Europe. But once he divided his troops between fighting both in the East and on the West, that this led to his downfall. So Calvin, in the 16th century, fought on two fronts with respect to the Lord's Supper. On the one hand, he had Zwingli and the spiritualists who were arguing that the Lord's Supper is only a memorial. It has spiritual significance, but there's no special presence of Christ in the Lord's Supper. And so Calvin had to debate against those people because he was insisting on the real presence of Christ. And on the other hand, he was debating with the Roman Catholics and with the Lutherans with respect to the nature of that presence. And one of the oddities there is Calvin's use of the word substance or substantive. When he was arguing with the Roman Catholic Church and with the Lutherans, he refused to speak of the substantial presence of Christ in the Lord's Supper. And yet when he was arguing with the spiritualists on this side, he insisted on the word substantive or substantial presence of Christ in the Lord's Supper. And some historians look at that and say Calvin was talking out of both sides of his mouth. Oh, no, no, no. What he understood was over here in this debate, the word substance was used in one way, and over here it was used in another way. Now, what were the two ways in which it was used? Over here, by the Roman Catholics and the Lutherans, who insisted in the substantial presence of Christ, the word substantial meant physical, that he is physically present. And Calvin was over here talking to the spiritualists who denied the substantial presence of Christ. What they were denying was the real presence of Christ. And here the term substantive or substantial meant real rather than physical. So against the spiritualists, Calvin argued for the substantial presence of Christ, meaning the real presence of Christ, and with the Catholics and the Lutherans, he denied the substantial presence of Christ because he was denying the physical presence of Christ. And we'll look more deeply at that in our next session.